You've probably spent hours, maybe months, maybe even years, staring at a screen or lying awake at 3 a.m., asking yourself one fundamental question. Did they ever actually care, or was I just completely invisible to them? When someone mistreats you, discards you, or systematically dismantles your confidence, the human mind craves a resolution. We are hardwired for closure. We expect that if someone inflicts deep emotional damage, at some point, the weight of what they did will catch up to them. We look for the flinch, the softening of the eyes, the pause before they speak, that tiny, fleeting window where the mask slips and you see a flash of genuine, human regret. Here is the unsettling truth. That flash actually happened. Contrary to popular belief, narcissists are not entirely void of human perception. They are not mindless machines. They see the impact of their actions. They recognize the unfairness, the cruelty, and the destruction they leave behind. In fact, deep within their unconscious processing, they are often intensely, suffocatingly ashamed of how they treated you. But you will almost certainly never hear them say it out loud. Why? Because for a personality structured around absolute control and perfect self-preservation, admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it is psychologically fatal. To say, "I hurt you and I was wrong," requires a person to look directly into the mirror of their own imperfection. And for a narcissist, looking into that mirror causes a violent existential collapse known as a mortification response. Instead of an apology, what you get is silence. You get projection. You get sudden cold detachment or aggressive rewriting of history where you somehow became the villain of the story. If you stay to the very end of this presentation, you are going to gain something far more powerful than a delayed apology. You will receive the exact psychological blueprint of what happens behind that cold exterior. We are going to decode the micro-behaviors, the hidden shame responses, and the involuntary behavioral leaks that reveal what they are actually experiencing internally. By understanding these hidden mechanics, you will finally stop waiting for a confession that was never designed to come, and you will learn how to unlock your own closure on your terms, starting today. Look at the baseline. When you observe someone operating under severe narcissistic traits during or after a rupture in a relationship, what does the surface behavior look like? It looks like smooth, unbothered composure. They move on quickly. They post on social media as if nothing happened. They speak about the past with a flat, detached affect, or worse, with a mild sense of amused contempt. If you analyze human behavior purely on the surface level, it is easy to draw the conclusion: they feel nothing. They don't care. They hit delete on our history without a single moment of hesitation. That conclusion is understandable, but scientifically, it is inaccurate. What you are witnessing is not the absence of emotion. It is a highly sophisticated, automatic behavioral armor designed to suppress one specific, overwhelmingly painful emotion: toxic shame. To understand why they act the way they do, we must distinguish between two fundamental emotional states: guilt and shame. Guilt is behavior-focused. I did a bad thing. Guilt allows a person to separate their core identity from their action. Because your core identity remains intact, you can say, "I made a mistake, I caused harm, and I need to apologize and fix it." Shame is identity-focused. I am a bad person. When a person with healthy emotional regulation causes harm, they feel guilt. They address the behavior, clean up the mess, and repair the relationship. When a narcissist causes harm, their psyche skips guilt entirely and plunges straight into core shame. Because their entire sense of self is built on a delicate, highly constructed illusion of superiority, perfection, and control, experiencing core shame feels like psychological annihilation. They cannot process the thought, I treated someone who cared about me terribly. To accept that thought would mean tearing down the entire constructed persona they rely on to function in the world. So the subconscious mind deploys immediate defense mechanisms to bury the shame before it reaches conscious awareness. Even though they will never say, "I'm sorry," suppressed emotion always leaks out through nonverbal cues and predictable behavioral patterns. When deep shame is triggered inside a narcissist, watch for three distinct shifts in their behavior. The sudden shift to discard or cold distance. When you bring a legitimate grievance to them, or when the reality of how badly they treated you becomes unavoidable, notice how fast they withdraw. This isn't just anger, it's a escape mechanism. Being near you reminds them of what they did. You become an active mirror reflecting their flaw, so they must smash the mirror or walk out of the room. Aggressive projection and deflective rage. If you push for accountability, the response is rarely a calm denial. It is usually a sudden, disproportionate spike in hostility. They will attack your character, bring up unrelated mistakes you made years ago, or accuse you of the exact behavior they committed. This is psychological externalization. If I can make you the bad guy, I am no longer the bad guy. Narrative revision, gaslighting. Listen closely to how they reframe the past over time. The story slowly mutates. Details are omitted. Your reactions to their mistreatment are reframed as the initial provocation. They are rewriting the script in real time, not just to deceive you, but to convince themselves of their own innocence. The greatest trap in recovering from a relationship with a narcissistic individual is the lingering expectation of a formal surrender, the moment where they sit down, look you in the eye, and give you the raw, honest acknowledgement you deserve. You must understand this key principle. Their refusal to apologize is not proof that you weren't wronged. It is proof of their inability to process reality. Expecting a narcissist to give you an authentic, humble apology is like asking someone with a broken leg to run a marathon. They do not possess the psychological infrastructure required to hold space for your pain without feeling like their own existence is threatened. Every day you spend waiting for their confession is another day you grant them remote control over your emotional state. True strength comes from observation, not reaction. When you step back and view their behavior through an analytical lens, the dynamic entirely shifts. You no longer see an invincible, cold-hearted mastermind who walked away completely unaffected. You see an individual locked inside an endless, exhausting loop of self-defense, running continuously from their own internal shadow. You don't need them to admit what they did. The evidence is already present in their inability to hold deep connections, their constant need for external validation, and their perpetual flight from genuine accountability. Their silence is not a victory over you. Their silence is their confession. Take your focus off their mirror, step out of the loop, and return your energy to the only timeline you actually control, your own. To truly understand why a narcissist acts with such cold indifference after mistreating you, you have to look beneath the surface of human behavioral design and examine the fundamental flaw in their internal architecture. On the outside, they present a persona that appears entirely unbothered, remarkably composed, and almost terrifyingly indifferent. They move on to new relationships with lightning speed. They speak about past conflicts with a flat, detached tone, and they behave as if the history you shared meant absolute zero. If you observe this behavior strictly at face value, your brain naturally draws a very logical conclusion. This person is a cold-blooded operator who feels no regret, no remorse, and no pain over what they did. However, from a behavioral profiling perspective, that conclusion completely misinterprets the dynamic. What looks like genuine confidence and total indifference is actually an aggressive, round-the-clock defense mechanism operating at maximum capacity to shield a deeply buried, profoundly fragile core of toxic shame. The human mind cannot survive in a state of constant, conscious psychological agony. When a baseline individual causes harm, their mind registers guilt. Guilt is functional because it targets specific behavior. It tells you that you made a mistake, but it leaves your fundamental sense of self intact. This allows an emotionally healthy person to process the mistake, take ownership, offer a sincere apology, and repair the damage. A narcissist, however, does not possess the psychological apparatus to process guilt. When their actions cause harm or cross a line, their internal system bypasses guilt entirely and triggers a violent flood of core shame. Shame does not say, "I made a mistake." Shame says, "I am fundamentally broken, flawed, and bad." For a personality structure built entirely around an elaborate illusion of perfection, absolute superiority, and untouchable control, experiencing core shame represents a total threat to their existence. It threatens to shatter the false persona they have spent a lifetime constructing. Because exposing this vulnerable inner core feels like psychological annihilation, the narcissist's subconscious mind deploys an immediate, automatic countermeasure. They erect an impenetrable wall of detachment, coldness, and contempt. The sudden, icy indifference you experience after a rupture is not a sign that they are neutral. It is a violent suppression technique. They are actively slamming the door on their own internal reality, because looking at the damage they caused would force them to look into a mirror that reflects their own deep imperfection. When you attempt to bring their behavior to light, or when you simply exist as a living reminder of how unfairly they treated you, you become an active trigger for that dormant shame. The coldness, the arrogant smirks, the quick discards, and the immediate pivot to new sources of validation are all high-intensity avoidance tactics designed to ensure that the suffocating weight of their own actions never reaches their conscious awareness. They are not walking away because they are strong, untouchable, or completely unbothered. They are running away from the unbearable sight of their own hidden, deeply painful flaw. Silence in the aftermath of deep mistreatment is rarely just a passive lack of speech. In the context of high narcissism behavior, it operates as an active, high-level survival strategy designed for absolute self-preservation. When you look at the mechanics of human communication, verbal admission requires an individual to cross a psychological bridge from their own internal narrative into shared objective reality. To say out loud, "I hurt you, I was wrong, and I take responsibility," a person must perform a complex sequence of internal actions. They must access empathy, acknowledge that another human being experienced real pain, and most critically, accept that their own behavior was the direct cause of that pain. For an emotionally integrated individual, this process is uncomfortable, but it is entirely manageable because their sense of self-worth is grounded in reality. They know that acknowledging a flaw does not mean they are fundamentally worthless. For a narcissistic personality structure, however, this exact sequence triggers a complete systemic crisis. Their entire psychological framework is built upon a delicate, rigid construct known as the grandiose self, an idealized, flawless persona constructed specifically to protect them from a deep, underlying sense of inadequacy. Because this false self is rigid and unyielding, rather than flexible and resilient, it cannot bend. It can only stand or shatter completely. When a narcissist is confronted with the reality of their own cruel or unfair actions, accepting that reality requires them to acknowledge a severe flaw in their conduct. In their binary, black and white internal world, having a flaw does not mean making an isolated mistake. It means their complete collapse into core shame. To avoid this internal catastrophe, the mind treats the act of admitting harm not as an act of relational repair, but as a fatal threat to their very identity. This is why silence becomes their ultimate refuge. Silence allows them to preserve the internal fiction that they did nothing wrong, that the conflict was blown out of proportion, or that you were entirely at fault for the breakdown. If they were to break that silence with a genuine, unvarnished confession, they would be forced to look directly at the destruction they caused, which would shatter the false narrative keeping their ego intact. Furthermore, maintaining silence serves a dual purpose in controlling the external dynamic. By refusing to engage, offer answers, or acknowledge your pain, they withhold the very thing you are searching for, effectively keeping you trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance and emotional fixation. They remain safe behind an impenetrable wall of non-engagement, while you spend your energy attempting to decipher their non-responsiveness. The total absence of a verbal admission is not evidence that they are unaware of what transpired or that they possess superior emotional strength. It is a direct manifestation of psychological fragility, proving that their ego is far too weak to survive the weight of its own truth. When a narcissist attempts to bury internal shame, the human nervous system simply refuses to cooperate completely. Unacknowledged emotions are not destroyed, they are suppressed, and suppressed emotional energy always finds an alternative path of least resistance to escape. Even when a person refuses to offer a verbal confession, their internal reality leaks out continuously through subtle, high-frequency behavioral indicators that can be observed and decoded. The first major leak is a sudden, drastic emotional withdrawal or cold detachment following a moment of mistreatment or confrontation. When a narcissist senses that their unfair behavior is visible to you, being in your presence instantly converts you into a living mirror that reflects their own deeply hidden flaw. Because looking into that mirror triggers intense internal discomfort, their immediate impulse is to retreat. They become stonewalling, distant, or completely vanish from the interaction, not out of strength or genuine disinterest, but because remaining near you forces them to confront the exact shame they are desperate to avoid. The second primary behavioral leak is unprovoked defensiveness and disproportionate rage. When someone is grounded in genuine innocence, a mild question or a call for accountability is met with calm clarification or an attempt to understand. When a narcissist is harboring hidden shame, however, the exact same inquiry is interpreted as a direct, aggressive assault on their false persona. Because their internal alarm system is operating at maximum intensity, their reaction is immediate counteroffense. They jump to intense hostility, bring up unrelated mistakes you made years in the past, or launch personal attacks against your character. This sudden spike in aggression is a projection tactic, an automatic attempt to throw the baseline of the conversation completely off balance. By manufacturing a crisis and forcing you onto the defensive, they successfully redirect all the focus away from their original transgression and onto your reaction, effectively protecting their fragile self-image from scrutiny. The third behavioral leak is rapid narrative revision and selective memory. Shame causes such acute psychological distress that the narcissist's brain begins actively rewriting history in real time to make the narrative palatable to their ego. You will observe them omitting key details of what occurred, altering the sequence of events to make your reaction appear like the initial provocation, or adopting a tone of complete confusion when you describe their past actions. They aren't just attempting to manipulate your perception, they are engaging in a severe form of self-deception designed to convince themselves that they remain blameless. These micro-behaviors, from the sudden coldness to the irrational outbursts and history twisting, are subtle behavioral markers that reveal what is happening behind the mask. They serve as definitive proof that the individual is engaged in a continuous, exhausting battle to outrun their own internal guilt. The psychological trap of waiting for a narcissist to offer a genuine apology is one of the most insidious hurdles in personal recovery, primarily because it roots your emotional state directly inside their sphere of control. When someone inflicts deep emotional damage, the human mind naturally seeks an equitable resolution. We operate under an implicit social contract that says, when a boundary is crossed or harm is committed, the perpetrator owes the victim an acknowledgement of that reality. We tell ourselves that once they finally admit what they did, once they drop the mask and express true remorse, the weight on our chest will finally lift, and we will finally be granted permission to heal. However, when dealing with a personality structured around high narcissism, holding out for that moment places your timeline for peace entirely in the hands of the exact person who disrupted it in the first place. By remaining in a posture of expectation, you inadvertently grant the narcissist ongoing leverage over your life long after the actual mistreatment has occurred. Every day spent searching their social media for a sign of regret, analyzing their vague messages for a subtle hint of remorse, or engaging in imaginary arguments where they finally break down and confess, is energy drained directly from your own present reality. It keeps you hyper-focused on their baseline, their choices, and their internal processing, rather than your own growth. The narcissist, whether consciously aware of it or not, benefits immensely from this dynamic. As long as you are waiting for their validation to confirm that your pain was real, they remain the ultimate authority in your life. Your sense of reality remains dependent on their permission, which effectively keeps you tethered to the original power imbalance of the relationship. To break free from this cycle, a fundamental cognitive shift must occur regarding what closure actually is. True closure is not a joint negotiation, nor is it a signed document handed to you by the person who harmed you. It is an internal decision to stop demanding a resolution from an entity that is fundamentally incapable of providing it. The moment you realize that their silence, their defensiveness, and their revisionist history are not signs that you were unhurt, but rather definitive proof of their own severe psychological limitations, the entire dynamic flips. You stop viewing their lack of an apology as a missing piece of your healing, and start viewing it as the natural, expected output of a broken internal system. Their inability to offer a confession becomes the closure itself. When you accept that their silence is the ultimate confession of their internal fragility, you reclaim your emotional sovereignty and realize that you never needed their permission to move forward in the first place. Reclaiming your emotional sovereignty requires a complete shift in how you process and interpret the behavior of a narcissistic individual. For as long as you remain trapped in the emotional blast radius of their actions, your mind naturally operates in a state of defense, constantly asking questions centered on your own worth. Why wasn't I enough to make them care? What could I have done differently to avoid this outcome? How can they act like I never mattered? These questions stem from a fundamental assumption that you are dealing with a person who operates under standard rules of emotional regulation and relational empathy. The moment you step back and replace emotional reactivity with cold, objective behavioral observation, that baseline assumption shatters, and the power dynamic in your life changes permanently. When you analyze a narcissist through a non-emotional, analytical lens, you stop viewing them as an untouchable, cold-hearted figure who held all the cards and walked away completely victorious. Instead, you begin to see the underlying architecture of their existence, an individual locked inside a perpetual, exhausting survival mode. Every action they take, from the inflated grandiosity and constant need for praise, to the immediate hostility when challenged, and the rapid discard of people who love them, is driven by an underlying panic. They are continuously running from an internal shadow of deep inadequacy and shame that they lack the psychological strength to confront. Recognizing this dynamic does not mean excusing their toxicity or opening the door to further mistreatment. Rather, it allows you to depersonalize their behavior entirely. You realize that their coldness was never a reflection of your value, but a reflection of their own internal limits. This realization allows you to reclaim your focus, time, and emotional bandwidth. Instead of wasting critical mental energy trying to fix an unfixable dynamic or waiting for a transformation that will never happen, you direct all that energy back toward your own path. You stop engaging in subtle battles for validation. You stop explaining your boundaries to someone who is determined not to understand them. And you step out of the chaotic cycle altogether. True power is not gained by getting the last word, forcing a confession, or witnessing their downfall. True power is achieved when their actions, their silence, their lies, and their attempts to provoke you no longer have the capacity to disturb your internal baseline. By observing the pattern for what it truly is, you strip away their ability to influence your sense of reality.